When the familiar faces vanish or go quiet, who tells us the truth and what fills the gap? Senator Lindsey Graham died Saturday night, July 11th at 71. His office called it a brief and sudden illness. Preliminary D.C. medical examiner findings gave the cause as an aortic dissection tied to an arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Well, that's a mouthful. He died hours after returning from Ukraine, where he had met with President Zelensky. His death immediately drew baseless online claims of foul play, falsely blaming Russia, Iran, Ukraine, and Israel. AP and PBS ran fact checks. The death itself became a live case study in how misinformation floods a vacuum. And then Senator Mitch McConnell, hospitalized back on June 14th after a fall at home. He was briefly unconscious, and then he developed mild pneumonia. Treated with antibiotics, and he's since moved to a rehab center. After weeks of silence, a Sunday statement and a photo with his wife, Elaine Chao, appeared. The story is the gap between what he finally said and the silence before it. And Representative Tom Kean Jr., who last voted on March 5th and then vanished for nearly 4 months, missing 148 straight roll call votes while his accounts kept posting, but never a photo of the man. He cited only personal medical issues. Reporters went into his district to look for him, and he returned on June 30th and disclosed a depression diagnosis and an extended hospital stay. The void made human, then filled honestly by the person himself. And finally, on July 14th, Representative Richie Torres introduced a Duty of Transparency Act to require members of Congress to disclose extended absences. AOC weighed in on this too. The MIA problem is now producing legislation. So the whereabouts and health of the powerful are their own information story. From the void, we go to the oldest weapon of all, the manufactured story, with someone who grew up inside the machine, our guest today. I'm Richard Schreiber, and this is True Journalism. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'm Tom Martin, and again, as Richard said, this is our podcast, True Journalism. As I was thinking ahead to this particular episode, the idea came to me that what journalists really focus on when journalism is being done with integrity and focus and dedication is really manage 3 types of information, or call the public's attention to 3 types of information: facts, truth, the void, as we've just been discussing. What was the story with Representative Tom Kean? That was people were wondering literally for months. And then the other 3rd type of information is fake news. We've heard that phrase, propaganda. Again, there's pure in much more detail from my friend, our wonderful guest today, about, I certainly recall those early days of the Russian incursion into Ukraine. Propaganda. So again, the 3 types of information. But it's an honor to have my dear friend Katya Soldak here. Thank you so much for joining us. Katya is a very experienced journalist, editor of foreign editions of Forbes magazine, documentary filmmaker. I remember some of our coffee discussions like years and years ago. You're talking about planning your documentary, and you went on to make the documentary, capturing the spirit of the people of Ukraine. And then within a matter of months, perhaps you can tell us the timeline, the unthinkable did happen. And I think, what was it, February of 2022, something like that. But welcome, Katya. We're so happy that you're here with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction and for having me on your podcast.
You're blessed indeed. So go ahead, Richard.
Great to have you. And certainly your memoir from 2017, I think it was, wow, a while back. This is how propaganda works. And those of us in America follow those kinds of engines around the world, certainly in Russia, certain Middle East countries, South American countries, etc. I don't think any of us really foretold that it would happen in America. But unfortunately, that's the current condition here, as accentuated by President Trump's ramblings on election interference last night in his speech, all anchored in baseless claims and distortions and propaganda. So it's a prescient time to have you on, Katya. So what was it like back in 2017 when you first wrote that that report. And fast forwarding ahead now, isn't it ironic that we as Americans are faced with that same reality?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing it back to life. That piece that I wrote, actually, it was my own kind of way to mark the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in 2017. Because when you write things like this, it's always interesting. Why would I write about it now? So I thought that maybe the world will be somehow following the 100-year anniversary of basically incredible takeover of half of European continent by Bolsheviks. And I just wanted to write a little bit about what it was like to grow up at the very end of the Soviet Union. And now we have, I think, a little bit more information about it. But at that time, it was not trendy to talk and write in English language media about what it was like to be a child of a propaganda. Plus, I was this sort of like a person who, I was very young during the Soviet Union years. And then it fell apart and I lived in independent Ukraine. But we either had people who grew up here and could speak and write in English well, and they didn't have really those memories, or they were younger people who never experienced the Soviet propaganda. So for me, it was a unique intersection of several factors that made me write about it. And because I think it was my advantage that I didn't study international relations, I didn't really listen to a lot of analysts that would give me like a certain vocabulary to use when I wrote about it. I would have to just write from my heart and from my memories, and more people could relate to it, because those who were skeptics, they would still see something there that was not like against the brainwashing or pro brainwashing. Basically, people from all ideologies and walks of life could read it without being irritated and thinking that I'm just on a mission to say something, another propagandistic piece. And I think it helped me because it was basically based on the memory of a child, and memory was not tainted by any agenda. It was the truth. We grew up brainwashed on all levels. And I find that up until today, 9 years later, it's still one of my most read pieces, and it's been cited in many research papers and dissertations because it's very detailed and because there is no agenda. And I think that's why it still stays evergreen.
Yeah. And they say that authenticity can sometimes trump, no intended allusion to that, but can sometimes make it more difficult to fact check or question somebody's reporting.
If I want to connect it to today, which was part of your question, we live in a very difficult time because of technology and social media and AI that makes it incredibly hard to deal with information. Back in the USSR, we only had the party line and everything was controlled, and very few people could get alternative news. So more or less everyone, after 70 years of brainwashing, were on the same page until the Iron Curtain was over. But here we have all kinds of micro channels where if the person stays in their bubble, it feeds more and more fake news. And you can have two people virtually with the same profile living in completely two different universes. And it makes it very easy to target the person, to target population and turn them against each other and feed them absolutely crazy stuff. And they believe in it. And I also find that for younger people, it's also very harmful because they never read articles. They don't know what happened before yesterday. They're never going to read long articles. So they just consume content that is fake news, propaganda, just some silly stuff. And they have no context for that. And those who really want to use a media space for propaganda, for brainwashing, for swaying public opinion, they already have a system in place. They create AI-generated images, videos, fake people that young people have no idea that they're fake, and they watch it, and it's really crazy. I think we're living in a time when it's a lot worse than back in the pure sort of very scarce information space in the Soviet Union and in independent countries after it fell apart.
And before I toss it to Tom, there was a stat that we looked at just last week that said now more than 54% of people get their news through social media. but only 22% feel that it's accurate. And I'm like, if that's the case, why would you pursue something that you willingly know is inaccurate? It is just a matter of convenience.
If some people at least know this concept, accurate and inaccurate, it's still better than millions of people just believing everything they see that flashes in front of them on instinct.
Yeah. I think that's because Americans are not well trained in authoritarian rules, so we push back a bit. Tom?
Yeah, no, I like the way you described that essay going back 9 years again, because you were not being militant and dogmatic and putting forth your own kind of propaganda. It's like, I don't know, I could cite a million examples here. I sometimes think of that. Speaking of documentary filmmakers, Michael Moore, who has a very liberal left-wing agenda. To me, it's still propaganda. I don't like propaganda. And I'd love to hear more how you perceive how things are working here in the United States. I can only imagine what other nations must think of this. I try not to get too biased or partisan in our episodes here, but I'm not necessarily proud of our leadership at the present moment and what our president says at NATO meetings and whatnot. But I'd love to hear your assessment of all of that a little bit.
I'll try, because it's harder for me to speak on a more broad level, because with all the crazy, I can't find another word for this. It's just a crazy cacophony of fake news and different voices amplified by algorithms. I work with information, so I had to narrow it down to something, and I can't follow everything. It's physically damaging to listen to all the reports of what's happening. I just check in, I look into things sometimes, but I don't follow day to day. I focus on Ukraine, I focus on facts, on maybe some geopolitical news related to Ukraine and Europe, because Ukraine is it's not separate from what's happening in Europe with all the elections and influences. But for instance, working as the editorial director for international editions, up until recently, I was also working with Latin and South America. I oversee Africa and European countries. There were times when it was very clear that there is a bias that is much bigger than something that we can influence with one article, because of real propaganda campaigns that are happening in those countries and big money behind it. And no matter how well-traveled and educated people are, if they're subject to, usually it's Russian propaganda, because they're super good at financing long-term campaigns when we're not even thinking about it, but there is already, African countries affected by that, or some Latin American countries. But I wouldn't know, maybe there is even more to it right now. I think it's important to have independent media outlets that still have fact-checking and voices that people don't doubt. But most people still stay in social media bubbles, and it makes it much harder. It's really hard. I'm not into pessimistic outlook on things. I usually believe that things will turn out better than they are. But I think that knowing what AI is doing and how AI can be used when it falls into the wrong hands, and it's usually the wrong hands that are plotting, not the right hands. The right hands are fighting for the next cycle of the elections, and authoritarian regimes, they want to stay there forever. So they're not thinking about elections tomorrow. They're thinking elections after elections, how they raise another generation that will be thinking that the earth is flat or vaccines are bad and things like that. So I do think it's a very difficult time globally. And America is also, as a very big country, very easy to divide, to spike confrontations. I've always thought so, even before 2016, when I watched what Russia did in Ukraine. And Ukraine is a big country. It's not a small country. It was at that time 46, 45, at least million people with different regions. And then just with some minimal propaganda, fake news, purchasing a couple of channels, you could turn almost the same like-minded people against each other. And imagine the number of states we have here and the history and immigrants, just really fertile ground for planting the seeds of hatred and creating a lot of disruption and bad things, which they, I think, succeeded. When I say they, it's a collective they.
Yeah. 70% of the world is being run by authoritarian regimes, so that number may have gone down with the departure of the Hungarian dictator. And I've said before that a lot of what we're experiencing here in America is almost like the current administration is following the Mein Kampf playbook. And Goebbels, if you say something loud enough, long enough, and often enough, people begin to believe it, which is
I follow
propaganda.
pretty much all the traditional playbooks because and I'm sure that you follow what happens to media. In my case, I'm a little bit more in tune with what's relevant to international and foreign correspondents. Just a few days ago, they finally announced this law that foreign journalists, when they have a work visa, they cannot stay in this country for longer than 240 days. They have to leave and then they have to come back, which makes it go through some procedure to extend their stay, which makes it very hard for foreign journalists to be here to see what's happening here. It's like another step to shut down access to information and freedom of speech, closing down outlets that were even the offices outside of America that were supporting freedom of speech and information, and here too, like the Voice of America and financing for a lot of other informational organizations. Those are very real steps to shut down the voices and to create non-transparent environment. Would they have enough time to succeed? Because it takes a little bit longer than one cycle, 1 year, 2 years. Hopefully not. But the steps are there, and it depends on what's happening next.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts as far as the leadership there in Ukraine. I personally, as an outsider, certainly have 1/100th or 1,000th of the information that you have, and none of that personal background. But I have a very positive impression of President Zelensky. I felt very embarrassed, or shall we say, I don't know if that's the right word, but again, his first meeting with Donald Trump in the Oval Office was just, I think, terrible.
Yeah.
I do not want that kind of behavior on the part of my president. But President Zelensky seems to have been very strategic about what to say, what not to say, and so on. But how important is support from the United States? And is Ukraine getting the support that they need? This war has been taking its toll. I can't imagine the buildings, the architecture, let alone the lives lost. And I was also thinking of some of the children that have been taken out of Ukraine. There's so many dimensions in which this is really a terrible situation.
Thank you very much for all the details that you brought out here, because with all the complexity and the war being in its 5th year, I feel that it becomes like a one big blurry thing for a lot of people who are not engaged with Ukraine directly, but it looks like you know what's happening. And it's a very complex situation because the president was the right man for the job when the war started. He campaigned on behalf of Ukraine, and he tries to listen to the voice of the people, because we find that a lot of people want different things. It's very hard to be a politician and the president, but he seems to do a good thing. And right now he's in the news, and everybody watching Ukraine, even on the front page of the New York Times, like after a big break, finally there is a story about Ukraine. The defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, has been dismissed by the President Zelensky, and people are out in the streets protesting. Think about it. It's the will of the people that's, again, shining through all the noise about good government, bad government, new people, old people. The people in the 5th year of the war, they saw that this was a good defense minister who made a lot of progress in the battlefield with technology, with drones. By the way, he's coming from digital background. He was the minister of the digital transformation, I don't know the exact word, a while ago. And he and his team, they did a good job. And only after 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, he's been dismissed. And the people are out there. They have something to say. There are a lot of young people with the cardboards that have slogans, nothing expensive, just out there in the streets, campaigning for what they want. Imagine Russia, where things are happening for 26, 27 years. No, smaller protests were very successfully shut down back. They were not even small protests, it's just compared to the country, they were just happening in big cities. But now they're just living under the rule of the authoritarian president. And in Ukraine, no matter what, after I think he was elected in 2019, so it's been a while. Under normal circumstances, Zelensky would have been re-elected, because we already had 6 presidents since in Ukraine gained its independence in 1991. Countries like Russia had what? One, and now it's Putin. Belarus has Lukashenko. I'm not even talking about all the stans where it's very hard to change governments and presidents, prime ministers. So Ukraine is a truly democratic country, and the people are protesting because they want to have a say in what's happening, and they really care about what's going to happen to their lives now, the war. So in terms of support, Ukraine needs support. Ukraine really progressed a lot in terms of technology since the war started. I'm working on a documentary. This is my second documentary about Ukraine. I know Tom knows about my first one. The first one was called The Long Breakup, and it was done around the time when Ukraine had Maidan revolution, when Crimea was invaded, when
2014.
Donbass was annexed, and it shows the transformation of people in my hometown in Kharkiv from being just post-Soviet people who didn't want to be with Russia, but they never really truly realized what it means, national identity and such. And through the story of local people in Kharkiv, including my family, I was able to show this transformation. So that was not my voice of God. That was not just some narration that I wrote. There were actual people showing how they changed in 2010, 2012, 2014. And now I'm working on the second documentary that shows it focused more on life in Kharkiv, my hometown, how they live there. So because of this film and following it very closely, I'm actually very well aware about how the war is developing and how much support Ukraine is getting or not getting. I traveled to Ukraine since the beginning of the full invasion. I would say many times. I traveled usually twice a year to Kiev and then to Kharkiv several times. Kharkiv is on the border with Russia. It's literally 20 miles away from the border. And I can compare how the Western support was delivered throughout the war and how it helped and it didn't help. And I can tell you that no, there was not enough support. It was not enough ammunition. It was not enough patriots. It was the interceptors. We never properly received. It was always some little portions of help released in some. We did get a lot of financial help, which was good. But right now, there's still a lack of interceptions because when Russia sends ballistic missiles, and they send, I don't know, let's say 450 ballistic missiles on Kiev, on the capital, and 90% is intercepted. There is still that fraction that falls and kills people. And they do the same with other cities. And Kharkiv, because it was not the capital, and it was also super close to the border, it was very easy to target, very easy. And we're not talking about a short-term war. We're talking about 5 years of life. My characters in the film, some of them had children. So think about it. At the beginning of the war, one of my characters' child was 4 years old and another one was a teenager. And now, almost 4.5 years, one is 8 and the other one, he's turning soon. It's a different life. So help, I think Ukraine appreciates help, but it was not really enough.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I have, Katya, is the war incredibly has gone on as long as it has. There wasn't really as much progress during the Biden administration, or it's murky and unclear in terms of the reporting. With Trump, we know that there's always this specter of his relationship with Putin, and anything that Trump says is always subject to question because he pivots a lot and says a lot of things that are not factually true. You mentioned the Patriot missiles. He made a statement recently that they were going to allow Ukraine to build them, and that's really not gone anywhere. But I just wanted you to contrast what happened during the Biden years with what's now happening with the Trump years. Has there been any change? Why can't America seemingly do the right thing here on either administration to end this war?
I think overall, there was some support, concern, some negotiations. America has not been openly not aligned with Ukraine's mission up until recently when it became confusing with some statements. But for Ukrainians, and again, the government, it's a different role. They have to meet, they have to negotiate. We don't know a lot that's happening behind the scenes. So in the public space, we all know what's happening. It's very easy to track it down. But I can tell you that, for instance, for Ukrainians, the ones that I speak with sometimes for my articles or for my film, they rely on themselves a lot. Ukraine is a very educated nation and has always been. There are a lot of programmers, mathematicians, engineers, physicists, and they have enough of resources and brain power to develop a lot of sophisticated things, which they did. I think the world is only now starting to see that. But a few years back, Ukrainian production and development of drone technologies and what you can do with them, it was progressing very fast and helping to change the battlefield and things in the battlefield and warfare drastically. And again, it's not something that was openly discussed because there are certain technology production facilities, but now we can see Ukraine can do things that no one thought they could do. The long range, achieving certain results way far from Ukrainian border. In that case, in the 5th year of the war, what the US administration is doing, it's in parallel with what Ukraine is doing for itself. And I won't be surprised that Ukraine is already the country that many other powerful militaries can learn from. Because not only active combat experience, where we consolidate also the training with the NATO and other things that pre-existed, but also new things, new warfare, meaning saving lives, using technology to reach to the most difficult areas in the front lines. I would pay attention to that because public space is just, it's talk. We're only allowed to hear what's out there. It changes all the time. But there are specific concrete developments that any general, any military leader would see how valuable they are. And that was, you want to be an ally of that. You don't want to be against that. And you also don't want the wrong, I repeat that after what other people say. It's not my thought, but it's been right now quite popular because it's common sense. You don't want what Ukraine developed in all areas of battlefield and warfare to be taken and stolen and replicated by the US competitors, I would say, right? Because you don't want that unique, very advanced technology to get into the wrong hands that would backfire. So I'm sure that there is an understanding of that. I just don't know how to connect certain things that are said and how quickly they change.
For sure. Do you have any sense of the view of the Russian people, if you can generalize? And again, I know you said if a person grows up within a system of propaganda, maybe you don't think for yourself. But some news reports I've seen in recent years talk about the casualty loss on the Russian side, and if support for Vladimir Putin is slipping away, maybe things can change from pressure.
It would be nice to hear that. I think it's true. But first of all, anything that comes out of Russia is a state media propaganda. There is absolutely no accidental numbers. That's why for journalists, it's even harder because you can't properly cite them. You want to cite the other side, but you really just repeating what the Kremlin decided to release. And that's never accurate information. And independent sources, I don't even know if they truly exist because it's so not transparent. You can keep pushing Russian people lower and lower. I don't know where the threshold is. They're very patient. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it doesn't matter what support is. They're still going to be fine. You give them bare minimum and they will be okay. I don't know. I have very little hope in that, but I think it has to be solved on some more systematic level and more lawful level with consequences and creating full safe space, international space for everyone to exist. And that can't be done just by changing public opinion in that country.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say propaganda can be used for false positives. I know there were reports that Putin was sick or dying, 2 years ago, and that didn't come to pass. That created this false sense of security, perhaps, or positivity. But in most cases, it's used for negativity, to keep people down, to divide people. But
I'm a
so,
journalist. Propaganda in any way is not a good. Any type of propaganda is not good. Educating, media literacy, learning how to consume information. Also, I think as much as I'm not against regulations, but I think with AI, there has to be some responsibility somewhere for what's allowed. I'm not talking about information. I'm talking about wild freedom that algorithms have to generate traffic and clicks by saying absolutely outrageous things. And that's something that need to be discussed, and maybe some policies need to be in place for that.
we know you mentioned the 2016, that a company called Cambridge Analytics supposedly worked with Russia to post all kinds of fake information about Hillary Clinton to specific profiles that were in independent states. And supposedly it had an impact. Cambridge Analytics was also used by the British government to get Brexit through.
Yeah, there were some really serious investigations of that. But other than you and me and Tom and a few other people who's remembering that, it was like centuries ago. For people who get into the same trap today, they don't even know that it happened in 2016. Most of them, unfortunately.
Do you think, I don't know, maybe this seems like a strange question, but do you think things need to get worse here in the United States before people wake up? We talked a little bit about complacency, people living in their bubble, and I just feel so much polarization in this country right now, so that if you're a MAGA Republican, certain stories don't even enter your consciousness, like we're discussing about Ukraine. I'm concerned how things are in this country, and I just wonder, how will things change? We need to wait out the clock another 2 years, or things seem quite bad right now. Not as bad as Ukraine, certainly, but I'm still concerned about our own country right here.
Absolutely. I think it's all connected, because countries like Ukraine, they always looked up at the United States as the place that could teach them about basic human rights, basic freedoms of speech. It's very unfortunate that right now a lot of countries look at the United States and they don't see the same leadership, that they could see before, regardless of what government was in place, because there were certain things that seemed like the institutions were working. I would never wish on any country to experience something that's worse, because it's not a theoretical thing. After seeing the war in my country and how any kind of turmoil affects people, I wish things would never get worse in the United States or anywhere else. But I also wish that more active, more people who have resources would pay attention to what's happening and do something about it. Because you might think that the institutions are strong, but if you're dismantling them little by little, one day you're going to wake up in another Russia, and you don't want that. And I've seen how it happened in Russia. It didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually. Maybe some methods were different because KGB always existed there. They were more skilled. They could use certain tactics that were really brutal and killed certain people. I'm not sure how that playbook can be adapted to the United States, but taking small steps here and there, that will do the job. And also people get used to it. It's like boiling the water. You boil it little by little, and then one day you're in the boiling water and you don't know that you are there because you got there gradually.
I want to circle back on, we talked a little bit about, again, the Cambridge Analytics impact on that election and what the role that propaganda plays in dismantling free elections. And we're seeing that in America. We have a sitting president who continues to spew falsehoods about a 2020 election he lost by 7 million votes. He's now saying that China got access to 220 million American voters in a database, which is being denied everywhere else. So to me, the speech that he gave last night was chilling, because it's propaganda positioned towards disevaluating or making our upcoming election in November, which everybody in this country recognizes the importance of. But he's already on his propaganda stance to try to discredit our free elections. And you mentioned aspects of authoritarianism. We've seen what ICE does. We've seen that they can withhold or basically approach someone without any provocation. They can go into a private home. We've lost a lot of civil liberties in that space because it's on immigrants, right? They don't deserve it. But when it's been turned on American people, that's really gotten what happened in Minnesota and then more recently in Maine, that's gotten real attention. But what is the effect on propaganda and free elections?
We all know how to fake the elections. Propaganda can sway public opinion. This is why you need to have independent media. And in smaller countries, it can become a very fierce battle. But you've seen what happened in Hungary after many years of propaganda and suppressing public opinion. Somehow, very quickly, at some point, it stopped working. So there is hope.
You know,
But I also want to mention that I'm just going to give you an example. In 2013, in December, when Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych changed his mind under the pressure from Vladimir Putin. Volodymyr is a Ukrainian pronunciation, and he decided that he's not going to go towards the EU and he's going to join Russia in some economic and political union. Students came out into the streets to protest. Just students, just 18-year-old kids who really didn't want to be back in the USSR. They wanted to travel, they wanted to work, have the rule of law like normal people in the West, in Europe. And the president sent the police on them and brutally beat them up. It was very ugly. And instead of running home and hiding, hundreds of thousands of people came into the streets, not only in Kyiv, but also in other cities, because that's the nature of Ukraine. Again, not a small country. People say it's a small country. It's not. It's the size of Germany or France. It has very distinct regions. But I think something in that spirit that was not really, first of all, inert or passive, but also never really authoritarian ruler, just brought them out into the streets to risk their lives. And they stood there for months until the president was ousted. To me, this is the reaction of the society to something that they think is not fair. And they fight that. And people look up at the police and they don't understand how you're supposed to protect us. You're supposed to have there's supposed to be some law in place, and then you beat people up. So we're going to join our voices and fight that. That's something that has been done in other countries. Yeah. And not just in Ukraine, in other countries as well. In Serbia right now, there are massive protests for several years now. I forgot, it's 2 years, several years. So it's 2 years probably after something collapsed, killed a bunch of workers, and then students came out and they out into the streets forever now. But nobody really talks about it because it's in Serbia. But it happens. There are countries where people unite their voices. They have no other means, just come out because they're fed up, and they also don't want their children to live in because they know it can happen. Here, I think people don't have enough experience with the change. They're fearful. I've seen people come in protest here in New York. I forgot which one it was, maybe the one that
King's Day or something, the big protests.
They were wearing masks, dark glasses, leaving their phones at home, thinking that they will be like arrested and thrown to jail. I'm like, what are you doing? You're not there yet. It's not going to happen. But if you're so much afraid of coming into the streets now, I don't know what you're going to do when things can become.
Exactly.
So anyway, you can't really compare because this is a very isolated country on a separate continent, far away from where things are actually happening. But I do think that we are responsible for our choices and for the future that we have, and more educated people with financial resources. Somebody who doesn't have to survive day by day should be more involved in working on creating alternatives.
Speaking of the future, what are your hopes for the documentary that you're making right now? And I don't know if you have a GoFundMe campaign or if people can support your work. I'd love to hear about that.
Oh, thank you so much for asking. Because there is a certain urgency to this project. I try to focus on it more than usual because I want to start showing it to people sometime, hopefully at the end of the fall, because it's very hard to make proper documentary film feature I'm still raising funds because we were able to get a lot of donors. Usually it's smaller donations because people care. They want to have truthful piece of information. A couple of larger contributions. So I feel responsible to follow through as quickly as possible and show it to people. The documentary is called My Kharkiv, Fortress of Solitude. And we accept donations. We have charitable donations or just some donations that can come to my PayPal account or for the film's PayPal account. It could be Katya Soldak at gmail.com, because any contribution helps. We finish in the film in Ukraine and it's a little bit more affordable there. So even if somebody gives me $500 or $100, it can cover a lot of post-production costs. And the goal is to give something that people globally can watch with enough content, but also enough emotion to understand what's happening. And as an American journalist and somebody who lives here, but also connected to Ukraine, I find that I'm a trustworthy voice to put that together and to connect to world. So I'm really excited about making this film. Anyone who wants to help, future distribution, any contribution now, any support is welcome to reach out to me, because it's not just for Ukraine. It's for basically truthful information and human dignity. And believe it or not, security, not just in Europe, but in the whole world. Because as a journalist, I know how to highlight certain facts when people would see that it's connected to them. It's not just some faraway Eastern European country.
Yeah.
So thank you for mentioning my film. I hope that very soon it's going to come out and we'll invite everybody to watch it.
Oh, we would love to see it. And we admire your work greatly. And it's so needed. It's somehow we're not talking about Gaza much anymore. The news cycles have stepped away from that. And I feel they've done the same thing even more on the Russia-Ukraine war, and understanding this was an illegal incursion. And
Let me quickly say that because of everything we talked about, the AI, the news, the crazy news cycle, I personally find, because I have a news digest about Ukraine where I get the information from Ukraine, we put a little bit more context sometimes, and I've been publishing it since the first day of the full-scale invasion.
Sure.
I find that as important as it is, something like film does a better job in informing the public and staying in history, because my first film is in educational institutions like Princeton and YU, somewhere else. I get sometimes emails from 18, 19, 20-year-old students who watched the film and they understood what was leading up to it. That's why the film that I'm making, I figured it's actually worthy of allocating a lot of resources, because hopefully it will stay and it will be watched by future generation of students or policymakers or just humans who would know what it's like to live during the war and what was happening, what the United States was doing. So the news cycle is very short. I can't cover every unfair situation in the world, so I focus on Ukraine. But I agree with you that things come and then they just disappear. And you know what? It's part of also the tactic that comes from the Kremlin to disrupt the information space. So most people would be like, I can't hear this anymore. And then they just start watering flowers, thinking about cats.
yeah, there's been a lot of, I guess, corollary comparison between Trump, who uses some of the same tactics. There's a reporter who said a few months back that living in America right now is like living in a Donald Trump reality show. Right? First it was Venezuela, then it was Greenland, then it was Minneapolis, then it was Iran. There's shifting major news stories, and there's a pattern to them. The way that they're introduced, the way that the media gets involved in accelerating the news story and hyping it. And then all of a sudden it retracts, or Trump pivots, or taco, I guess is the term they use, that he has done with sanctions. And we in America are all waiting with the Iran war, because I was talking with a dear friend who lives in Germany, just outside of Cologne, and things are pretty bad there. There are massive layoffs. The cost of petrol is through the roof. People are scared and really concerned. And this is all attributable to what America has done in this war in particular. It's just had a catastrophic ripple effect throughout the world.
It's very tough time right now on all fronts, and for journalists especially, because you make so many choices, tough choices, how to cover what's happening. Do you repeat it? Do you amplify it? Do you not say something? How many times you repeat something that you know that it's fake? Because it's part of it. I always say that information is a very powerful weapon, as I'm sure many people in leadership positions know. And if you deal with information right in a positive way, it's possible that you won't need to supply weapons to some countries or medical supplies to heal wounded people.
Yeah.
Because it starts with information. And that's why I think what you do with your podcast is important. My making films is important. Courageous journalists covering and investigating things are doing a good thing. We just need to figure out how to deliver it to people who would not read long investigative pieces or watch. And also the problem is that people just consume content that they like to hear, the opinions they like to hear. So it doesn't help educating anyone and informing anyone. I think that's where the real problem is, because something like what's happening right now, hopefully will pass to the next cycle. But AI, this crazy news space, is not going anywhere until something happens and it gets somehow cleaned up in some way. That's where I think we need to be like ahead of it. Because again, in all the elections, everything, like you said, fake news and propaganda can sway opinions in different ways. And it starts with information.
Sure. We're all blessed to have you today, and a documentarian filmmaker on what you do really exposes and shines the light and a lens on important stories. And to your point, when the evidence and the visual things are there, they're indisputable. Although we know authoritarian figures often refute stuff that they've actually said. And we've seen, obviously, Putin and Trump do that as well. Tom, I guess we can go
I
ahead.
just want to say, I also love the quality, remembering your first documentary, and I'm sure you bring this quality to what you're doing now, putting a human face on people who are affected. You like the mother of 2 children who said they've aged 4 years. What would that be like? It's very easy for us to read an article in the New York Times or something, the big picture, thousands of people affected, and it's like, oh, that's really terrible. But when you speak to a mother, it must be so hard for them. So I really admire what you're doing, and putting a human face on the situation is just so important, I think.
And
Thank you
that's
very
what we,
much. It's been only a couple of weeks since I last visited Kharkiv and Ukraine, Kiev, the capital, Kiev. I make sure that I stay very much connected, because if I speak about it, I need to know exactly what's happening there. And it really helps. And I appreciate your faith in my film. And it's good to know that there is support and people want to watch it, because that's the motivation that I have to make it. It's not a money-making thing. I'm not paying myself or producers. We just try to make a good quality film so people can watch it. It's basically a mission film. And but also still unbiased as you can be in this crazy time, and factually accurate. That's
You're
part of the challenge.
a great journalist, and we're honored to have you with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
and we normally wrap up the show with a collection of stories that have kind of had 2 sides to the coin, if you will. Speaking of propaganda, is often the word we're confronted with when we see the dichotomy in the way a simple news story is reported. So if you want to stick around, Katya, for a few minutes, we'll just kind of
I
go
wanna
through
hear
those.
that.
Love to hear your comments on it as well. Tom, I guess I'll start out. So Jay Clayton, who was recently one of the nominees for a cabinet position, in a routine hearing was asked a simple question. Obviously, the Democrats are positioned to ask this question, and that is, who won the 2020 election? And right now, as we mentioned, with Trump starting his propaganda campaign to discredit the 2020 election and future elections, no one who's now reporting and being interviewed, rather, in front of Senate hearings will admit that Joe Biden won the election by the 7 million votes. And it's just so curious to see this kind of happen.
I think one of the senators, I'm sure a Democratic senator, was saying, it must be so awkward for you sitting right there And I know, we all know what the
Yes.
answer to. You're playing for an audience of one, and you can't even say the truth. I'm speaking of the truth. So yeah, truth again. Often it takes us a couple of weeks to post our episodes here, but I think all the events we're talking about right now are very important to keep in mind. They don't lose their significance, that's for sure. But at the time we're recording this last night, President Trump had a primetime speech, and he teased some very important information about the election coming up. And again, it was just propaganda. More than 60 court cases were brought charging rigging of the election, and none of them found any evidence whatsoever. I heard an analyst comment today saying the networks like CBS News that chose not to air this primetime speech usually goes without saying. Anytime a president says, I have a primetime speech, it's very important. Of course, they get the airtime, but not right now. And they said it might have been helpful to air it because I was thinking it's like a mad king. He's losing his.
Watching him, fall apart. Yeah.
But anyway.
That's
And-
about making choices, how the networks and people in charge make choices to amplify or not to amplify.
Exactly.
And interesting that CBS didn't run it, Tom, because obviously their CBS News is under siege.
Cozy with the president.
Yes, Barry Klein in particular. Another scenario, acting AG Todd Blanche is up for appointee permanently to that position. And when he was asked if he and Trump are friends, Blanche said, I'm his lawyer. Sorry, was his lawyer. And Senator Durbin said, you're still President Trump's personal attorney.
Yes. And with things on a razor's edge here, in terms of Republican rule in the Senate, one of the senators, or probably a couple of the senators, I'm not quite sure, said, why have you not met with the survivors of the Jeffrey Epstein tragedy? And I said, why don't you do it today? And so apparently he did meet with a couple of family members and so on. They said it's like he's just going through the motions, which doesn't surprise me. But that whole situation.
His predecessor never met with any of them either. That's just, it appears wrong. It occurs to be wrong. Another news item was the Paramount Warner deal, which the DOJ approved, even though a 12-state coalition of Democratic attorneys general sued on Monday to block it on antitrust grounds. I don't even know if there was an antitrust organization left in the government. I think it might have fallen victim to Doge cuts. Quite a different spectacle under the Biden regime when he had a particular young woman, an Indian woman, who was really going after a lot of the antitrust legislation.
Exactly. There used to be a position called Solicitor General, or like an ombudsman, an independent party to investigate. It's like, oh, we're letting all those people go. It's like, yeah. Okay. And again, we were talking about information, truth, a void of information, and propaganda, and I would say falling into propaganda. And again, it's in a way trivial. It's important yet trivial, getting people to talk about the reflecting pool on the mall in Washington. Maybe you should spend those minutes talking about the war in Iran, but they charge vandals. We're going to prosecute those vandals who destroyed the new surfacing, the company that was a no-bid contract for millions of dollars to redo, make it look more like Mar-a-Lago. But the Washington Post investigation said, no, those seams and tears in the reflecting pool, that just happens because of the process. It's not vandalism. So again, propaganda everywhere you turn.
And then recently the president's financial records were made public. And obviously there's been a lot of stories around how much money he's made, particularly through cryptocurrency, 1.4 billion. And curiously, the former cryptocurrency oversight committee within the government was disbanded. And CNN reports that Trump promoted 20 plus companies on Truth Social just days after buying their stock. At least 44 purchases across 21 firms, including, not surprisingly, NVIDIA and Tesla and a number of technology companies. It's heat goes on.
You were saying earlier to that expression, boiling the frog with Trump and his profiting on cryptocurrency and side deals and all of that. Also, something, again, as you said, reporting favorably on companies that he just invested in the stock. If any other president had done this in previous administrations, it would be a scandal. but it's like boiling that frog. It's very disturbing. Anyway, and earlier, Richard, you also mentioned the shooting by ICE team members, and none of them are wearing the surveillance video as they should. They're always coming up with the story right away. They aimed their car at us and so on. Again, officials in Houston and in Maine are getting a little up in arms. We want to see this evidence. The federal government is saying, no, we can't share that with you. And that's reached quite a bad state as well.
Yeah, we talked in the past about the Iran school strike, that we actually denied that it was one of our missiles when I think Al Jazeera and other networks reported the opposite. Iranian state media reported 168 children and 14 teachers were killed in contrast. And I know, Tom, you've often said the statement that some media person said, or we can't trust the government that has an authoritarian figure there for reporting the accurate news.
Stephen Colbert says, and are we supposed to trust an authoritarian dictator? And it's like, or should we trust the Iranians? In other words, the man in the Oval Office. Exactly. That is, speaking of, again, of Trump early on, when at the time of those first strikes on Iran, he was saying, rise up, people of Iran, where we've got your backs and so on. But again, a number of executions. Katya, you were talking about the courageous protesters in a nation. People have courageously stood up in Iran and then they've been executed.
Yeah, terrible.
Well, none of it is simple. Basically, what you can do, just study what happens in different countries, different environments. Nobody's calling for any kinds of dangerous situations. It's just what happens in some societies and how they deal with issues they don't accept.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess we'll close with a routine update on a history exhibit. The Park Service swapped the president's house slavery exhibit overnight, removing panels like the dirty business of slavery. The void was made concrete under an executive order in 2025.
Yeah. No, we know whitewashing America's history on the 250th anniversary. Exactly. Anyway, but why don't we wrap it up? It's wonderful discussing, and I think these are all important issues and doing our part to raise awareness. And Katya, you're doing an amazing job with that. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much. And we usually close with it inspired by Edward R. Murrow. Good night and good luck. We'll see you next week, folks.
Thank you both.